what this world is coming to.
Yes, the rhythm, the rebel. Without a pause, I'm lowering my level. The hard rhymer, where you never been, I'm in. You want styling? You know it's time again.
Welcome to the Chapter 19 overview, Internal Troubles, External Threats, 1800 to 1914. Main idea. China, the Ottoman Empire, and Japan responded to 19th century European expansion and internal problems in different ways, with varying levels of success. Relevance. When the 100th anniversary of the start of World War I passed in 1914, much was said about its importance in creating the world of the 21st century. The events in this chapter set up changes in international relations that led directly to World War I. As I'm sure you've noticed by now, history consists of a chain of events linked to the present. Some of the links in the chain are more significant than others, but they all contribute in some way to making the present. In this chapter, you will learn about the surprising decline in the fortunes of China and a corresponding rise in the fortunes of Japan. The Ottoman Empire was on its last legs during this time, and the collapse of the final Islamic empire of the region has much to do with the troubles faced in the Middle East today. Setting the stage. The key context for this chapter is the Industrial Revolution, which you studied in the last chapter. Remember that the process enhanced competition among European nations for power, and that they still sought economic and political influence in the East. You also should recall the Qing dynasty in China and the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, previously strong states that posed threats to the European dream of dominance. You've learned a little about Japan, but this era is its main entry onto the world stage, and you'll go into more detail about that country at the end of the chapter. The first heading is called the External Challenge, European Industry and Empire. 19th century European expansion was driven by new social, political, and economic developments. The Industrial Revolution created massive changes in Europe, which in turn motivated the expansion known as imperialism. You will learn more about imperialism in the next chapter, but for now, you should know that it was a new wave of colonialism, with European nations establishing overseas colonies primarily for economic reasons. Industrialization created a need for raw materials, cheap labor, and new markets for finished products, all of which could be found in the new colonies. These colonies were primarily in Africa and Asia due to the wave of independence movements that happened in the American colonies in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Industrialization facilitated imperialism by providing communication, transportation, and military technology, shown in this picture. Politically, Europe was motivated by nationalism, with individual countries competing with rivals for influence abroad. This was a natural outcome of the intense competition among European states. Socially, imperialism created a relief valve for pressures from the lower classes, as economic growth helps to preserve jobs and keep the economy stable. New perceptions of the other. This new wave of dominance was justified in Europe by a racist view of humanity that was reported to be grounded in science. Europeans saw themselves as superior, entitled to the riches that came to them as a result of their military superiority. Certain races were seen as superior to others, as shown in this diagram, and the success of imperialism was presented as proof of these ideas of racial dominance. The science involved applying Darwin's theory of natural selection to humans, with the idea of social Darwinism predicting that the strong races would eliminate the weak in a natural and acceptable progression. Reversal of fortune, China's century of crisis. China was unable to successfully counter internal and external pressures, and the state weakened throughout the 19th century. The rest of this chapter looks at challenges faced by three main states, both internally and as a result of European expansion. The first we look at is China. China had domestic troubles in the 1800s for a variety of reasons. Like Europe, China experienced population growth, but without an accompanying industrial revolution, the economy was not able to keep up, and unemployment and poverty skyrocketed. The state was unable to manage the crisis, and discontent grew, especially among the lower classes. The unrest culminated in the Taiping Uprising, which swept across the country from 1850 to 1864. It was led by Hong Jiquan, shown here, who claimed he was the younger brother of Jesus, and said that his efforts were heralding the end of the world. This type of movement is known as millenniarism, meaning that it proclaimed that the end of the world was coming. The rebels called for sweeping changes in Chinese society and had initial success. A combination of government forces and private armies, hired by landowners, defeated the rebellion, but not before 20 to 30 million people were killed. The Taiping Uprising weakened the Chinese state and left it vulnerable to Western pressures. As you might remember, the global silver trade worked in China's favor, as Western nations used the precious metal as currency to pay for desirable Chinese goods. The British found a method to turn the tables on China by selling opium grown in India to China for silver, shown in this picture. From a Chinese perspective, the opium trade created two negative consequences. a trade imbalance in Britain's favor. Look at the snapshot on page 885 for more detail. And a drug problem among the lower classes, which further harmed the economic production of the country. China responded by fighting the opium trade, including the destruction of chests of opium seized on European ships. The British and other Europeans countered with military action in the 19th century, resulting in two conflicts known together as the Opium Wars. The end result was China's defeat and treaties that granted economic control in parts of China to individual European countries in an arrangement known as spheres of influence. The result was the permanent weakening of China. So in this map here, if you look at the key, the spheres of influence down in the bottom right are shown. And so Japan gained this part of Manchuria as its sphere of influence. Russia gained the other part of Manchuria as a sphere of influence. The British gained eastern and western China. The French gained a sphere of influence here in southern China. And the Germans this small area here. A sphere of influence essentially grants the European country the privileges and power of a colony without direct control, and it is definitely not working in China's favor. The failure of conservative modernization. The government's response to these troubles was known as the self-strengthening movement, and is aptly described by the title of this section. China attempted to simultaneously return to its pre-modern roots and to selectively adopt elements of the industrial age. For instance, it sought to re-establish the Confucian examination system while starting up a limited industrial program with factories, shipyards, coal mines, and a telegraph system. This compromise effort to combine the past and future was not popular, and resistance culminated in the Boxer Rebellion beginning in 1898. These rebels opposed foreign influence, killing Europeans in China. In response, Western powers occupied the capital, weakening the government even more. Discontent with the government's response to these Western pressures led to the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911. The Ottoman Empire and the West in the 19th century. Like China, the Ottoman Empire faced Western influence with attempts at modernization, which resulted in the weakening of the state throughout the century. This section begins with a reminder of the greatness of the Ottoman Empire at its peak in 1750. But during the middle and end of the 19th century, the empire lost much of its territory to aggression from Russia, France, and Britain, among others. So this map in red, this red outline, is the territory of the Ottoman Empire in the year 1800. So you can see it really encompassed much of the Mediterranean, certainly the eastern region. And as you can see on the map, they lost territory in purple, shown here, in the first, 3/4 of the 19th century. And then quite a bit more shown in orange, focusing in southeastern Europe, and down here in North Africa, particularly Egypt, in the last quarter of the 19th century and into the first quarter of the 20th. So the green is the Ottoman Empire in 1914, which was the beginning of World War I, and World War I was what caused the final collapse of the empire. The loss of Egypt to the French was especially significant, leading to an independent nation that challenged Ottoman influence over the Islamic world in the coming decades. After the independence of states in southeastern Europe, the boundaries of the empire were closer to those of present-day Turkey, which succeeded the Ottoman Empire after its fall in 1914. Much of this weakness was due to the changing economic landscape. As you remember, the Ottomans once anchored the western overland trade networks that connected Europe across Asia to China. By the 19th century, trade with Asia was almost entirely sea-based, and the Ottomans had to submit to increasing economic influence from Europe to maintain any presence in global trade. The political and economic weakness that resulted earned the state the nickname the sick man of Europe. In response, it went through a series of internal changes in an attempt to meet the rising threat of European dominance. Reform and its opponents. After early attempts to modernize around 1800, the first major effort was the Tanzimat movement, beginning around 1839. This effort combined industrialization with changes in the Muslim character of the state. Non-Muslims were given equal rights, and new policies were enacted, which expected citizens to be loyal to the dynasty first, rather than the Islamic religion. This secularization had its supporters, called the Young Ottomans, who worked to transform the character of the Ottoman Empire, emulating the great nations of Europe. This painting here shows an interaction between officials from the Ottoman Empire and from the Austrian Empire, which was its neighbor to the west. These reformers wanted to westernize the state while retaining the core Islamic traditions of the empire. Sultan Abd al-Hamid was a supporter, agreeing to a constitution that called for an elected parliament. He soon moved away from these reforms and returned to authoritarian rule, adopting the ancient title of caliph, or successor to the prophet. Frustration with this movement away from modernization led to the formation of a new group called the Young Turks, who were more extreme than the Young Ottomans, calling for complete secularization. They took power in 1908 and awakened animosities within the empire between Turkish and Arab influence, contributing further to the fall of the empire after World War I. Outcomes comparing China and the Ottoman Empire. This section compares the effects of European influence on each state, looking ahead into the 20th century after the collapse of the imperial systems. In China, an experiment with democracy was followed by a communist revolution, and the Ottoman Empire became the secular state of Turkey. Both of the new states turned away from traditional practices, more so in China than Turkey. This meant a movement away from Confucianism in China, while Islamic cultural traditions remained strong in the Arab heartland. The experiences of China and the Ottomans represent the difficulties of facing European expansion, but there was one successful example from Asia to be discussed in the next section. The Japanese difference, the rise of a new East Asian power. Japan successfully responded to Western influence, making political and economic changes that transformed it into a new Asian power. The Tokugawa Background. In Chapter 15, you learned about Japan's reaction to growing European influence over Asian trade in the 17th century. As you may recall, Japan resisted that influence, expelling foreigners from the country and permitting foreign trade only in one city. These policies were enforced by a government led by a shogun from the Tokugawa family, an example shown here, which ruled Japan in the emperor's name from 1600 to 1850. This time was notably peaceful, which helped to stimulate economic growth, making Japan more urbanized and transforming the samurai from a warrior class to one of administrative bureaucrats. Peasants increasingly moved to the cities, and literacy rates rose. All these characteristics set Japan up for a successful transition to an industrial economy. In the first half of the 19th century, corruption and famine led to peasant rebellions, which shook confidence in the Tokugawa regime, creating a politically unstable government. It was this situation that Commodore Perry from the United States found when he met with Japanese officials in 1853. Commodore Perry went to Japan to demand a more open policy towards foreign trade. The meeting was full of veiled threats. Perry gave the Japanese a white flag as a gift so they could surrender if war broke out. Having learned from the experience of China, Japan agreed to unequal treaties, which many young samurai saw as an unacceptable humiliation at the hands of a foreign power. Their anger developed into a civil war, and in 1868 resulted in the restoration of an emperor named Meiji to the throne. The Meiji Restoration ended the rule of the shogun and also initiated a stunning program of industrialization that made Japan a world power in 25 years. Modernization Japanese style. Politically, the Meiji Restoration ended the authority of the daimyo and samurai, creating a government that combined a European-style elected parliament with the ultimate authority of the emperor. Japan was seized by an attitude of, if you can't beat him, join him, embracing a number of Western customs from educational systems to dances and hairstyles. The result was a new version of society that combined Japanese traditions with Western ideas. Unlike in Europe or the United States, industrialization was accomplished under the control and guidance of the government, which built railroads, telegraph lines, and factories. This helped to reinforce the power of the emperor while standardizing the industrial economy. A similarity to other nations was the impact industrialization had on the lower classes. The government raised taxes to pay for the program, which hurt poor families. Working conditions in factories were poor, and young women sent from villages to cities to earn money made up a large proportion of the workforce, particularly in the textile industry. Unions were illegal. The emphasis was on participating in the transition to an industrial economy as service to the emperor. It was not pleasant for everyone, but it strengthened Japan's status in the world. In 1902, Western powers revised the unequal treaties, essentially recognizing Japan as an equal. Once industrialized, Japan set out to increase its international power by going to war with neighboring rivals, creating the empire shown here. So if you look at the map, this area here is Japan in 1875. The red lines show railroads built, which is proof of industrialization. And there were two wars that Japan fought, one against China and one against Russia. As a result of the war against China, the territory acquired by Japan really was down here in Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula, and part of Manchuria up here. And as a result of the war against Russia, Japan gained this area up here to its north. In particular, Japan's defeat of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 created waves of changes. Western nations now saw Japan as an equal, and in Russia, the defeat led to a revolution that would eventually culminate in the world's first communist state. Japan's experience was significant for the future as well. The Japanese victory served as an inspiration to people who were colonial subjects of European powers, showing them a path to resistance that would eventually shake the foundations of imperialism. Japan's Asian empire would also be a contributing factor to the outbreak of World War II. The dominant worldwide trend of the first half of the 19th century was industrialization, and the dominant trend of the second half was how both industrial and agrarian nations dealt with the pressures that inevitably accompany such massive social, political, and economic change. Now for the 10-second spice review. Responses to industrialization in Eurasian states often harmed the lower classes and also affected the authority of traditional governments. Harnessing the power of natural resources led to advancements in military technology that made conquest by European nations possible, justified by a pseudoscientific racism. A desire to continue the process of industrialization led industrialized powers to seek economic influence in official colonies and in spheres of influence. Now for the visual summary. The big idea in the chapter is domestic challenges and European influence on those main empires. So we had unsuccessful responses in China and the Ottoman Empire. And in China, those unsuccessful responses included the Taiping Uprising, the Opium Wars, and the self-strengthening movement. In the Ottoman Empire, the unsuccessful responses included Tanzimat, the Young Ottomans, and the Young Turks. And then we also had a successful response to European influence, and that of course is Japan, and its response included the Meiji Restoration, a state-sponsored program of industrialization, and colonialism and the development of its own empire. That's your Chapter 19 overview. Happy reading!